Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly update. For those of you watching live, I apologize for being a few minutes late. All right, a reminder that this is LGBTQ plus History Month, and National Coming Out Day was a couple weeks ago. And so we have a few more days left for you to access information on the LGBT History Month website. All right, our numbers. As of today, we have a little over 44 million cases across the world, and 1.169 million deaths have occurred worldwide. Hello, motorcycle. In the US, we have 8.7 million, almost 8.8 million cases, and 226,000, almost 227,000 deaths have occurred across the United States. In California, we're getting closer to that 1 million mark. We're now at 908,713 cases and 17,475 fatalities. Of note, across California, we are seeing a slight increase in our positive rate statewide at 3.3%. That's still a pretty low rate, but last week we were at about 2.7, so that is creeping up on us and something we'll want to watch very closely. If you'll recall, last week we were real nervous about the tier this week, and I'll talk about that in a minute for Fresno. We now have 31,096 cases in Fresno County, 439 deaths, an increase of 9 deaths since last week. And in terms of hospitalization, we had went up a little last week to 110. Now we're down to 96. So we're really starting to see where we're fluctuating in a general range between about 85 or 90 to about 110 to 115. This may be our quote-unquote sweet spot, but of note this week we do have an increase in ICU. And if you look at that middle graph on the left, you will see that while the hospitalization, if you go up one to the top, the positive is kind of evened out there. The ICU is up a little bit. Now these are pretty small numbers from 18 to 28. But we are seeing a slight increase, and that would be a little bit of a concern in terms of the acuity of people getting COVID. But for now, the hospitalization seems to be fairly steady. So in terms of the system for reopening, the tier system, we somehow managed to stay in the red. So last week we had seen that we were at 7.3 positive cases per day per 100,000, which is about 73 cases per day on average. Now we've dropped down to 67. The really important point for that is anytime your tier changes, it's because you've stayed in either a worse tier or a better tier for 2 weeks. So now that we came out of the purple tier, we have a couple of weeks to get things under control, should we have a week where it goes into the purple again. So for instance, next week if we were in the purple, it would have to stay in the purple for 2 weeks since we're all in the red this week. So that's important to note. But all of our numbers came down into a better position in the red tier this week. So if you look there, 5 as the positivity rate is right on the edge of the orange, which is a better tier for us. So if we can get it below 5, we may be approaching an even better tier. The 6.7, I believe we have to get it under 6, and so we're a little far off with there, so red may be where we sit. And then even with our health equity metric, and remember this is in our lowest census tracts in terms of socioeconomic status, we're improving there. We went from 7.9 cases to 6.8. So overall, we're solidly in the red tier, really, really positive, particularly given that we're now far enough out from Labor Day to pretty safely say that maybe that little 7.3 last week and the 7.2 a couple of weeks before was indicative of a little bump from Labor Day, but it didn't take us into a bad tier. So, say your prayers, cross your fingers, whatever you believe in, that we can stay in this better red tier and maybe even start to approach the orange tier. So one of the questions I was asked, and there's a lot of writing on here, don't worry, I'm going to talk more than I'm going to expect you to read this. Someone asked me to comment on what does turning the corner on COVID mean? That they'd heard kind of from higher level leadership within the county that we were turning the corner. There's certainly some national leadership conversations about whether or not we've turned the corner on COVID. And so it really does depend on who you ask, or maybe it'll just go away after the election. That was a joke. Anyhow, so I want to just go over a few things to talk about. What does it mean to turn the corner? And clearly, from a nationwide perspective, we are seeing in some parts of the country really high rates of infection and high rates of hospitalization. And I'll give you one example. In El Paso, Texas, it has a population of about 850,000 compared to our county's population of a little over 1 million. And when we were at the worst part, the middle of the summer, when we had the highest hospitalizations, we were experiencing about 313 individuals in the hospital each day who were positive for COVID. That doesn't even count the ones that were suspected, but who were positive. San Antonio right now has 780 some odd people in the hospital, so more than double what we had in the hospital at our worst time for a population that's lower than our county. And so there are some parts of the nation that are really experiencing surges right now. In fact, in El Paso, they're returning. They had a surge previously where they had to utilize refrigerated trucks to hold the bodies of people who had died from COVID. And so, I wouldn't say that we've turned the corner nationally if you use that as a metric, but there are some things that we could consider. So COVID is a coronavirus, so what do we know? We know that COVID is a coronavirus. Will it behave like another coronavirus we're experienced with, which is the common cold? Well, in terms of seasonality, it doesn't seem that way right now. In Fresno, we experienced a surge in the summertime, kind of indicating that typically like with the common cold, you tend to see it decrease in the summertime. This one doesn't seem like that. We do know it's very infectious, but we don't know the dose of infection needed to catch it. We know that the virus seems more prevalent in some populations, either by age or ethnicity or some other underlying condition, and or some populations are more represented in higher acuity settings, like with hospitalizations or with deaths. But we don't know exactly what determines how susceptible someone is to getting it, as well as what would make you not susceptible to getting it. We do know that people develop antibodies, but we don't know what protection that provides you or how long that protection will last. There has been some newer studies showing that some people are acquiring COVID a second time, but we don't know all the details about that. And a newer study came out showing that the antibodies decline over time, and so that would indicate perhaps that protection will go away eventually. We know that protective measures can mitigate spread, but there's still a lot of skepticism about that across the population, and so even though we know that those will work, not everyone is following them. There is a large, what's called a sequelae of symptoms, which means there's lots of different symptoms people can show when they have COVID. The questionnaire those of us who come to work each day have to fill out has a litany of symptoms that you kind of think, wow, I can't be sick with anything, or it could be COVID. Whether that's a fever, a sore throat, a cough, nausea, headache, whatever, all of those could be COVID, and that's kind of hard. It's really difficult when there's such a sequelae of symptoms to really know what is the exact mechanism going on that's causing people to get so ill. The other thing is we saw it in young people, and we're seeing it in elderly or older people, or people, I don't think of myself as elderly, but people my age, that they think maybe the antibodies are fighting a person's own body, and so you're starting to see like an over response from the immune system. And so lots of different symptoms that make it difficult to really know what you should expect when you have COVID. So it is really not likely that it will be fully eradicated anytime soon. So the only way to eradicate a virus, and there's one virus that we've eradicated in the world for the most part, and that's smallpox, is either for most people to get it and have some sort of lifelong immunity from getting it. We don't think that's the case. I mentioned earlier, they're beginning to think that those antibodies decrease over time. Or for everyone to get a vaccine, which offers lifetime immunity, like what was done with smallpox, like I mentioned. Remember, we get a flu vaccine every year, so we don't necessarily have lifetime immunity to the flu because there's different variants of the flu. Or for annual vaccines to be needed, so some way they figure out the genetic makeup of the virus each year and what the most likely virus variant would be each year, and you would get a vaccine every year to mitigate the chance that you would get it or that you would have a less sickness to it. Or some sort of periodic vaccination schedule where they could figure out that some people would get it and their immunity might last longer either because of their age or the health or no underlying conditions versus young kids or elderly or people with underlying conditions might need that vaccine. Or for some type of medical intervention to be developed which would really significantly reduce morbidity and mortality. That's why there's been such a focus on things like remdesivir and hydrochloroquine and things like that that maybe would make it where even if you got it, you're going to be okay pretty assuredly. And we just don't have anything that has passed the scientific review to say that it would reliably work for the majority of the population. So those are the types of things, and then people talk a lot about herd immunity, but even with herd immunity, you don't eradicate a virus. And so with smallpox, for instance, it's not that everyone in the world got smallpox and eventually it went away. It's that we developed a vaccine and everyone in the world got the vaccine until so many people had the vaccine, even if not everyone got it, if people stop acquiring a virus because you're not getting exposed to it because enough people either have had it or had the vaccine, then you can eradicate it. And so it's hard to imagine right now that we're anywhere near that with COVID. So what are the things we look at? And I kind of group these in terms of the metrics we're familiar with. So the tier system, why do we have the tier system? We have the tier system because remember back when we talked about flattening the curve? Well, learning to live with COVID until one of those things happens, the vaccine, the herd immunity, the treatment, what have you, until one of those things occurs, we're just trying to manage it. We're trying to live with it. We don't want it to overwhelm the healthcare system. At the same time, we don't want our economy to completely collapse because we're all in lockdown. And so the tier system is California's way of trying to measure the right things that would tell us that it's not out of control. So that case rate, the number of positive cases per 100,000, the positivity rate, and that health equity measure are what California's chosen right now to keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening across the state of California that might indicate that we're in a surge. And try and keep things at a measured state where we can still go grocery shopping, maybe go out and get a bite to eat, where kids can return to school, where some of us can come into work, where people who we serve can get their needs met without everyone getting COVID and increasing hospitalizations and deaths unnecessarily. So that's the tier system. And turning the corner for COVID might mean getting to a happy median and learning to live with COVID. Not necessarily eradicating it, not necessarily having a vaccine, but we've learned to live with it where we're not letting it get out of control nor overwhelm us from an economic or other fashion. Social isolation, anxiety, depression, etc. The other COVID metrics that we look at, hospitalizations and deaths, are just additional pieces that can tell us whether or not we should be concerned that it's out of control. And then some milestones that we're watching closely are that medical care and treatment, looking at scientific journals, something I do to see, okay, what does the latest study about remdesivir say, or does dexamethasone, the steroid, I know President Trump got dexamethasone, and does it help or does it not help? Is that something to give early when you first get the diagnosis, or is it something that helps later? Those are all things that are really important for us to be keeping an eye on, because that could help us in terms of turning that corner. And then vaccine development. It was just announced today that schedule, there was an ambitious schedule really indicating that maybe we would have a vaccine by next week, the election day, and now that's gotten pushed out. There's been a few reports that some of the vaccine trials have had some concerning outcomes that have slowed things down. That's typical and usual. It doesn't mean the end of the vaccine. It just means they have to understand better how that happened, why that happened, if it's a concern for broad distribution of the vaccine. And then watching herd immunity. I've read a few articles that indicate that there are parts of Europe, particularly places like France and Italy, where the amount of infection, the amount of COVID is so high that they're beginning to think that they might be approaching percentages that could be something they could study in terms of herd immunity. But not quite there yet. But that's the kind of thing that we might look at to tell us, have we turned a corner? I would say for the world, no, we still have COVID happening, and in some places in the world, it's really bad. They're locking down in many countries in Europe, even as we speak, new lockdowns in France, because they've seen that surge again. And then in the United States, we have parts of the United States that are really struggling right now, such as El Paso. And then in California, we actually do look better. I know there's a lot of criticism of how it's been handled, but right now we look a little better than some parts of the country. And in Fresno in particular, wow, we're at a really good place right now, and I'm really hoping and praying and crossing my fingers that maybe we've gotten to the point that people are tolerating the precautions, wearing their mask. I know I see it a lot. And keeping their social interactions to a level that we can manage the amount of virus that we're experiencing. So that's my take on what turning the corner on COVID means and what we might be watching as we move into the future to tell us where we're at in that regard. All right, real quickly on the Creek Fire. The Creek Fire is still a little active. On a call this morning, I heard that it's still approaching the northeast part of the fire is approaching the Mono County, and they're preparing to declare a disaster there. It is getting closer to Mammoth Lakes and Mammoth Ski Resort and such, and so that's something that they're really working on. It's a delicate balance right now with the fire. We want weather that might help them put out the fire. So things like a good old winter storm or a good fall storm that dumped some rain or some snow in those higher elevations would help the fire. But in the lower elevations where we've had a lot of fire erosion occur, where that vegetation's gone, we would have to watch it very carefully for things like mudslides and rock slides and how that runoff into our watershed occurs. So right now, I think I mentioned this last time, the next slide shows that we're still doing a lot of winter readiness activities across that area where the fire was to both ascertain what the riskiest areas are in terms of mudslides, as well as where we might want to do some remediation in terms of the watershed. So lots of activity going on there. There's a big focus on the new FEMA benefits that came with the National Disaster Declaration. And just continuing to support our county staff who've been impacted by the Creek Fire. Either they had a loss during the Creek Fire or they've been a first responder, and that can be really difficult. We talked about that the last couple of weeks, and so there's lots of supports being offered in that regard. And then on the Health and Human Services Task Force, really looking at those longer-term supports for people immediately impacted by the Creek Fire, whether it's housing or food and such. And so that is ongoing. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation today. I'm going to look over. I don't see any questions right now. I will mention that I have gotten questions over the past few weeks about how long will we telework, how long will telehealth services be the focus. We are looking into continuing to explore how we could expand the ability to see people in person. We know that we have some people whom we serve who occasionally or maybe routinely are going to benefit more from an in-person treatment, but we want to do that safely, so we've been pretty slow and pretty methodical, working with the county on what that could look like, how much space do we need, how much separation, what environmental controls can we put in place, and those are the things like taking someone's temperature or putting a screen, a plexiglass shield in front of people, certainly wearing our masks and that type of thing, but also looking at some air purification and HEPA filtering and that type of thing. And so we will continue to explore that. I can assure you that no changes will be made to anyone's schedule or where they work without advance notice and working with you. I know as school slowly but surely moves to at least an optional hybrid schedule or in person, that might afford us the opportunity to look at some more flexible or hybrid work schedules. But again, we're taking our time, we're doing it slowly and methodically and safely. And so you should continue to hear from me and expect that there'll be communication that occurs regularly about how we'll proceed forward with this. And I don't have any more questions. I'm going to look to Brian and see if we had any via text.
Yeah, one just came in.
Okay. Oh, one came in. It's been reported that medical or mental health specialists were en route, and it made me wonder whether Fresno County even has anything like the Portland MRT where, okay. I think what might be meant by this question, there was recently a police reform commission that formed in Fresno to look at some reform to how the police do their job. Obviously, with some of the recent, in the past several months, but certainly in the past many years, as the heightened scrutiny of police interactions with people of color has occurred with deaths that we can all remember, particularly George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery come to mind readily. That Reform Commission came together to say, are there ways we could do things differently to invest in the type of services that would reduce the need for police to intervene? And so one of the things that the Police Reform Commission is looking at, and I believe they've made a recommendation, is that the police no longer respond to calls of individuals who are in a mental health crisis. Most of you probably know that we have a crisis intervention team program here in Fresno County where we have clinicians that partner with law enforcement both in the metropolitan and rural areas. We think that that's a really good program and that it has really set the stage for improved services for individuals who are in a mental health crisis. What I would tell you and what I told the Police Reform Commission is that we can envision a time when we could reduce reliance or the involvement on police in those calls, and that we believe that where we're at in the process, it could head there. but that we're not quite ready for that. And we believe, I will tell you, one of the things I've been most impressed with is how the police department in Fresno has evolved in their interaction with our team. And so I not infrequently get emails or interactions with the police where they're really concerned with how a person who has mental health issues was treated in a crisis. And I'll just use as an example where maybe the team worked really hard to place a 5150 hold, and then they're concerned that it seems like that person got released inappropriately, and they've really worked hard to advocate for good care to be provided. So I feel like we have a pretty good program. Could it be better? Are there ways to improve? Sure, absolutely, and we are invested in that. But we're not sure that we're quite there yet. We may not have a choice. The commission, I believe, is going to recommend that end, and if that happens, if they are no longer funded to participate or supported to participate in that program, then we will be working actively for an alternative model. We don't believe that it will completely disrupt services, but that's something that we're exploring and will be prepared to deal with. I think that's what that question was involved with. If not, feel free to reach out to me and I'll try and answer it better next time. Any other questions? All right, we had no other questions via text or email, and so I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great weekend. If you're going to trick or treat, please do so safely.